Science connects the complexity of life, from the basic building blocks at a microscopic level to massively interacting populations. It guides public policy. It addresses the pressing challenges to human health, habitat, and well-being. The Biocomplexity approach encompasses multiple disciplines, experiential learning, and looks at science as it exists and interacts in the world. Science connects researchers, highlights collaborations, and helps solve issues that face our lives today.
Hello everyone, my name is Becky Freema with the Biocomplexity Institute of Virginia Tech, and joining me today is Roger Shirk and Maggie Couvillon, both researchers and faculty here at Virginia Tech. We are going to further, I guess you could say, our discussion about beekeeping on a research level. Maggie, let's talk to you first. Tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what brings you to this topic today.
So my name is Maggie Couvillon. She said I'm an assistant professor of pollinator biology and ecology in the Department of Entomology here at Virginia Tech. I have lots of twists and turns in the route of how I got to where I am today, which is namely a broadly trained bee researcher with a particular focus on honeybee foraging. So I started out actually in neuroscience. So I was on my way to getting a doctorate degree in neurobiology, and I was pretty unhappy with what I was doing. And I didn't have the vocabulary to describe why I was unhappy. Now, retrospectively, looking back, I can say I wasn't doing the things that interested me. At the time, I just was kind of vaguely dissatisfied. Mm-hmm. And I happened to stumble across a paper that described honeybee behavior in the context of neurobiology, and I absolutely thought it was the coolest thing I had ever read, and I fell in love with it. And so I had an opportunity to change direction, and I did. Instead of studying neuroscience and songbird behavior, instead I went and did honeybee behavioral ecology. So in particular, now what I can say is that I'm less interested in the brain mechanisms that generate the behavior. I'm more interested in the actual behavior in the field, in the natural setting, and the adaptive value or the evolutionary underpinnings of that behavior.
Okay, very cool. And Roger, tell me a little bit about how you kind of found your way to this topic of bees and the research you do.
Yeah. Twisted turns are, I think, the topic of today. I started out as a fish biologist. I did both my master's and my PhD in fish, and especially for my PhD I got really interested in the question of why animals cooperate. So these fish that I worked with are cichlids from Lake Tanganyika in Africa, and they are somewhat unique in that the young stay with the parents and then help raise successive broods even after they become sexually mature. So they forego their own reproduction to assist someone else in raising offspring. And that's very costly. And the question is why, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would they do that? And so that's kind of the question that has driven me for a while. But I then did a postdoc with primitively eusocial bee. So that's a native bee in England that has a very similar system where the offspring help mothers raise successive broods, but it's not as fully integrated as the honeybee, where the reproductive division of labor is complete between the queen and the workers. So that was a model system I used. But at the same time, I then started to elbow my way into honeybees because this research group in Sussex in England where I worked had them established there, and they were just a marvelous study organism, and that's also how I met Maggie.
So you guys are both over in England together?
Yes, we were both working there as postdocs.
So tell me, and Maggie, I'll go with you on this. What did you hope to learn, and what do you continue to hope to learn by this form of research and this studying you're doing?
So I'm broadly interested in both basic and applied questions of honeybee foraging and recruitment. So what do I mean by that? What by basic questions? Honeybees communicate to each other where they find good locations of food. And I find this communication process called the Waggle Dance extremely interesting, and there's a lot we still don't know about it. So, for example, they're actually not very accurate or precise in their communication, and that continues to interest me. From an applied perspective, because the honeybees communicate where good food is, if we're interested in trying to help the honeybee, it's always important to know where an organism collects its food. And here, that organism actually tells us in a way that we can understand where it's collected food.
And I will follow up with you, Roger, when Maggie, you just said, if we want to help them, this is how we do it. I will twist that and ask, why do we want to help the honeybee? Why is it important to ecology, to human life, to everything else?
Well, honeybees are extremely important pollinators, and so there is a demand for honeybees to be around too. They are managed, one of the few managed pollinators, where we can have huge quantities that we ship into, for example, orchards to pollinate our fruit. They are easily manageable like that, and I think that's one of the major reasons why we should look after them. But I'm sure Maggie has more things to say.
I was going to say, if the honeybee disappeared tomorrow, what would that mean?
Well, luckily, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the honeybees will probably be around longer than we are. But for the honeybees in particular, it has become more challenging to manage them. So they face a lot of stressors. We have what we call the 4 Ps. Mm-hmm. So the honeybees face problems with pests, with pathogens, with pesticides, and with poor nutrition. Those are kind of like the 4 big challenge areas. And if you're a beekeeper now compared to a beekeeper half a century or century ago, it's a lot more difficult to make a living purely on, for example, honey production. It used to be possible.
Oh, okay.
Nowadays, a lot of beekeepers rent their honeybees out for, as Roger intimated, to help pollinate crops. So in particular, their pollination services. So they are responsible, and it's estimated kind of 1 out of 3 food bites that you take is there thanks partially or completely to the honeybee. So a lot of the items that add the diversity and the flavor, the nutrition to your diet are there because of pollinators, honeybees being one of the most important because of their management. We can manage them, we can bring them places, but also because their sheer numbers.
Is there anything that we can learn? And I don't know if this really does translate. Honest question, from how they work as a society within themselves that maybe humans could take a little hint from.
So they had a TED event at the Houses of Parliament in London, and then the topic was democratic societies. And I was very much an outlier, being the only, bee researcher in the group. But there are a lot of aspects of how the colony functions that are very inspirational for democratic societies. So, for example, when a colony is trying to decide between different potential new nest sites, so the time has come for them to find a new home. Mm-hmm. They have a process where different bees will go out and survey the different homes, and then they come back and communicate what they have found, where they have found it, and kind of the quality of the new home. And the hive essentially does like a voting process, and once quorum, so majority, is reached, the whole hive will then go with that selection, even though you might have had some dissenting votes along the way. So I think that's kind of a good inspiration for the democratic process.
And you've kind of talked about this, but I want to clarify it a little more here about how they find their food and how do they tell other bees where to find the food. You kind of mentioned the Waggle Dance, but kind of give me more. I don't quite get that.
Yeah, so the Waggle Dance is highly ritualistic behavior where a forager that has been out in the landscape finding a resource, and this resource could be food, nectar, pollen, could also be water, and on hot days they need water to cool down the hives. It can be a nest site in the context of finding a new nest. And so they perform this ritualistic behavior where that returning forager will run on the wax comb in a figure of 8 motion. Then they turn back on themselves, go back to where they originated, do another straight run, turn the other direction back to the origin, and in that straight run they waggle their abdomen. That's why the Waggle Dance. And this straight run contains information about the location of where that resource is. So Basically, it gives the direction in the angle of that straight run relative to up, and it will give the distance indicated by the duration of that straight waggle run. So that linearly translates to distance outside the hive flown to the resource.
I was going to ask that, because so if this is all taking place within that frame, within their hive, I guess, essentially, I assumed it was out in the world saying, hey, waggle waggle over here, there's a flower, but it's not even close to where the food is. They're in their own hive saying this.
Yes.
Right. So that's one of the cool things about the Waggle Dance. So everything is going on inside the hive with the other bees who are perhaps not actively foraging on something else. So they all, they will be inside the hive. And these are the unemployed foragers.
Okay.
And a bee who has found a good resource then wants to recruit her unemployed sisters, the unemployed foragers, to this resource, and this is how she gives them the direction. She says, you go this far and you go in this direction. And so all that is happening inside the hive.
Huh.
And then the recruits, the bees that were previously unemployed, then leave the hive. And as Roger said, they know the direction and the distance, which is what you need to then get to the new location, which is the resource.
That is so amazing that they can do that within this dark box. I don't know if it's dark in a hive, I have no idea. But, within this dark box that they can do this.
Yes. So the way the dance followers, the sisters of that forager, read the signal is through vibrational cues. So this abdomen waggling will create vibrations on the comb and around the bee, like acoustic signals, sound waves. And the bees that follow the dance can sense these sounds, and they can then infer how the bee is dancing in the dark of the hive.
Wow. So, okay, this bee comes back and says, all right, guys, I found a sweet spot. I found the jackpot. We got some great food. What is considered in bee world great food? What do they eat? What would be a good find?
Well, I can answer that in two ways.
Okay.
So, in general, they will do waggle dances for anything that's a good resource. So this will change depending on what they need at the time. A colony is usually always motivated for nectar.
Okay.
Depending on the time of year, they'll be very motivated for pollen. And then, if it's time to find a new home, it will be for a new nest site. When they're looking for a new home, they won't be foraging for food. And then, as Roger also said, when it's hot, it's water. So it could be different things. So there are a lot of things that will determine whether or not it's good.
Okay.
And it's very context dependent. But I can say that, for example, you can have a honeybee that is foraging on the runoff from an M&M factory that's sweet, and they will dance for that because that tastes good to them.
We'll dance for M&Ms.
That's right. But that's not necessarily a good food source.
No product placement.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right, I would assume that sugar and candy is not a good thing. Would they actually, I don't even know how they determine that if do they smell it, or what is it that makes them realize the M&M factory is nearby?
So for things like flowers, it's a little easier, right? Because there is a scent that's associated with the sweetness. So I think what you're getting at, and you're absolutely right. The sweetness of the nectar is a very important metric for how much the bee values that flower.
Okay.
So the sweeter, the better. Because if it's sweeter, it has a higher sugar content, and so it has more calories. So for the colony, then it's a better resource. And they can find that through a lot of ways. Perhaps they've been directed there by a waggle dance that their sisters have done. Perhaps they're a scout themselves looking out in the landscape. Maybe they have memory of that same flower scent. So they've previously foraged on, for example, some white clover, and so there's a particular scent that's associated with that flower, and when they come across that in the landscape, they know that that's previously been very productive, so then we'll go find white clover someplace else. So there's it's a multimodal signal.
Okay.
How the things they find and what is considered good changes, but in general, nectar, the sweeter the better. And then for pollen, there's a lot of studies that are going on showing what kind of pollen bees will target. It seems to be it's an interesting interplay for what they already have versus what they're missing for the nutritional content of the pollen. But it is also context dependent, so they won't always be looking for pollen. They only look for it when they're actively rearing new brood.
Okay.
New
So here's a question, and I don't even know how you begin to study this, which is how do you study the language of the Waggle Dance? Because we can't feel that vibration, and you can't see it if they're in a dark hive. So how do you do this?
Yeah, so we keep the bees not in the normal hive boxes that are out of wood and that are dark inside. We put them between glass panes. These hives are called observation hives because we can observe the behavior, and we can have them inside a building connected to the outside. The bees can go outside and forage naturally, and then they come back into the hive, and we can observe what happens inside the hive.
So visually, you can actually look at a bee and say, that bee's doing a Waggle Dance now.
Yes, we can look through these glass panes and see what they do on the comb. And when they perform that Waggle Dance, we see that figure of 8, and we can then use that information to find out ourselves of where the bees have gone by decoding that information that is in the duration of that straight waggle run and the direction they indicate on the comb.
That is impressive.
Yeah, it's really cool to see.
I've seen those glass panes with the bees, and to me, who does none of this, they're just moving and buzzing and flying around and looking busy.
Well, they are doing that too.
But that's as far as I go on my attention to detail.
But the Waggle Dance it's a very easily recognized, robust signal. We could show you what it is, and you would be able to then pick out the other dancers. So it's not something that you need special training to be able to recognize. The Waggle Dance, as Roger said, it's this figure of 8, and these bees are visible to the eye. So it's actually a Nobel Prize winning discovery that is you can see with the naked eye. There's not a lot of Nobel Prize winning discoveries that you can do that for, but for the Waggle Dance you can.
I think that's really cool. Now, here's another question. Talking about how everybody wants to feed the hungry bees and everybody wants to help, but we're not all scientists, we're not all researchers. So someone says, plant this beautiful flower and bees will come. Good intentions, but maybe not always the best idea.
Yeah, well, I think anytime you plant flowers and bees come, there's an inherent value to that because we're increasing our exposure to nature. But I do think that there is a lot of energy and goodwill at the moment to try to help not just honeybees, but pollinators in general. And sometimes this may lead to some undirected, well-intentioned, though it may be, but undirected efforts. So we know that bees have a harder time collecting food now than what they did in the past. And so there are some incentives from the federal government, from the state level, from local organizations, here's seed mixes and plant these and you'll feed the bees. We don't actually know if these efforts are having the intended effect. That's a little bit where my research comes in.
Gotcha.
To try to evaluate areas and land types and efforts to see how they're helping. And but I do think that pollinator gardens, which is something a citizen scientist could do, so an everyday person, everything from your neighbor to yourself to a Girl Scout troop, can create one of these gardens. The key is what should go in the garden.
Yes.
And that's something else that I hope to be able to contribute to, especially for us here in Southwest Virginia.
So if someone was listening right now to this podcast and you said, the key is knowing what to plant, without giving them a long list, should they be, running down the greenway while they're listening to us and don't have a pen and paper in hand or driving in their car, top 3 things that might be good, or is it not that simple?
Well, I don't even think I need to give you the top 3 things. I could say they can find out for themselves. It won't be, maybe a research study, but you can go to a garden center, and usually they're out in the open, and you'll see bees on some plants.
Oh, there you go.
You'll see bees not on some plants. And we have plant varieties that we have cultivars that we have created that perhaps have lost their nectaries, or maybe they've made the nectaries so they're harder to access because we're trying to select for flowers that have this big beautiful pom-pom, but maybe then we've lost something along the way that had a biological value. And we can let the bees tell us that. Okay. So that would be a simple thing now for anyone to do.
Okay.
What I hope to generate in the future would be recommendation for plants, for gardens, for this particular region that's really based on vetted scientific research. So check back in a couple of years, but until then, we could say use your own eyes.
Okay. Roger, I was going to ask you kind of the same thing. What should people
Well,
do?
I think one thing that we found in England, which might or might not be applicable to here, is that there are times of the year where it's harder for bees to find forage. For example, in spring, all the flowers in the meadows come out, and they find quite a bit of food, and the trees come into bloom maybe early summer or spring too, and mass flowering crops like oilseed rape usually bloom in spring, and so there is plenty of stuff around maybe earlier in the year. And then as the year progresses, as we get into autumn, suddenly these resources dry up a little bit. And so high summer was a particular hard time in England for the bees to find food. And so if there are things that bloom in such a period where there is a dearth out in nature, then that could help sustain populations better. And I should say that's really Maggie's work too.
I think I'd like to kind of wrap it up with that, because I think that it's so interesting to hear your research, yet it also sounds extremely difficult to an extent. Even though you swear to me that I can pick out a Waggle Dance, I believe you, sure. I actually do believe it. I think that you could show me and I'd be like, okay. But I think it's good to wrap it up with letting people know these are some simple things you can do. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a researcher to kind of play a role in the ecosystem and the ecology of all of this.
Well, I think maybe a good analogy would be putting out a bird feeder. Are you going to help save all the birds? Probably not, but it's very pleasurable from a personal point of view to be able to see the birds. You've increased your own exposure to nature, and you've certainly helped feed that bird.
Right.
So I think maybe it's a similar thing. I don't think planting pollinator gardens are going to save the world. I think that those kinds of benefits need to come from a policy level, and policy changes are very slow, as we know. And I hope that they will be based on research, and I hope that there's a lot of people working on these types of problems, how to help honeybees, and recommendations should be based on these types of questions and the data that come from them. But that doesn't mean that kind of everyday citizen science efforts are valueless. I think that they're valuable.
Roger, any last thoughts on just kind of the future path and where you hope this takes us?
Well, I guess Maggie said it right. I think we hope to provide some evidence-based or the basis for evidence-based policy changes in the end. And that's what we are working on. So we are developing methods to understand better where the bees have gone based on observing the dance. And we then also have to vet these things against other pollinators, because the honeybee is not the only pollinator. So, how do management changes that we do for the honeybees, how do they affect maybe other pollinators too, and so on. So there's a mesh and kind of a broadening of questions once we get to that.
Wonderful. Okay, so Roger Shirk, Maggie Cuvion, thank you both so much for
thank you very much
taking the time to talk to us about
you.
this. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm Becky Fremall with the Biocomplexity Institute. I can't thank you enough for your insight on behavioral ecology, the bees, and how science connects.
Sharing knowledge accelerates discovery. To learn about other transdisciplinary collaborations, go to bi.vt.edu. The Biocomplexity Institute of Virginia Tech revolutionizes information biology, personalizes healthcare, and develops new tools to accelerate the pace of scientific discovery.